and I failed miserably. After hearing a number of things that attempted to describe the character of this area of the city, and the evolution of it and so on and so forth, I was compelled to try to make some corrective action, and that was my very serious mistake. Because at the end of that very lovely dinner, I thought my only contribution was going to be, I baked Kathy an apple pie as my contribution to the dessert. But what I inherited was her enthusiasm for my sharing my views with other people in the neighborhood as a way of energizing what is already a very successful neighborhood and in a time of considerable change. So one of the things that I agreed to do was to share with you in a kind of semi-anecdotal way my observations over half a century of living and working here in Cambridge and being involved as I was with MIT and MIT's activities, both academic and developmental in terms of real estate. How all of that evolved, and what lessons we learned from it. So I'll try to share that with you. I think one of the things I hoped that Kit would do for us, since I will only deal with the last 50 years, is to give you a sense of what Cambridgeport was like prior to the middle of this last century. I have to realize we're now in a new one. Because I think a lot of it is fundamental to how this area has evolved. Maybe she'll take a minute or two to give us kind of take it from the Dana farm or wherever you like.
If you have this, Lisa, thank you. You're so sly.
Good evening.
Good evening.
If you have this map, that one of the handouts, if you look at that, that might help you get a picture of what Cambridgeport was originally like. There were only 3 farms or estates that were in this neighborhood up until after the Revolution. Before that, everything was happening in and around what is now Harvard Square. And this land that we're on now was marshland and farmland. And it was either bought by or given to the residents of Cambridge to farm or to use as grazing for their cattle. And so after the Revolution, then things started to happen, particularly when the Longfellow Bridge opened up. Then that opened up the development of this area. And a lot of what was south of Mass Ave.
What year was that?
It was 1793. I think it was Thanksgiving Day. So a lot of the land south of Mass Ave was owned by just a few families, particularly the Dana family. So Dana Park was given to the city by a Dana. The Dana Street, when you start reading Cambridge history, the Danas are everywhere. The first development happened, the first housing happened like Green Street, Franklin Street, and William and Watson Street, named after William Watson, who owned the land. And then Lopez Street was his wife. So it was a slow development And it took a while for the development to get down to what is now the Dana Park area. So it was a fairly slow development. There were some fringe businesses that were down here, factories. There was the first soap making factory in this area was between Brookline and Pearl Streets. And there's Sharapa Street. Am I in the right neighborhood for Sharapa? What's the S Street here? Yes. That, if you look down that street, you'll see it's triple deckers all the way, because those were all built at once. That was where the soap factory was. And so when the soap factory lasted until, say, the 1870s, and when eventually that all got taken down, those triple deckers were built on the land. And the area so the shoreline of this area originally stopped at Brookline Street. So if you were on Upper Brookline Street, you'd be walking along the edge of the marshes. And so at high tide, a lot of this area would flood. And Brookline Street down to, I would say, maybe Lawrence Street. That was where the road originally stopped. And then it took a big curve around, it was like a peninsula. It took a big curve around down to the river, all the way to the river, where Fort Washington is. And there was an area called the Pine Grove Swamp, which there's a lot of different opinions about what that actually meant, but it seems to have been a heavily wooded area. And that was very slow to build up. And people wrote about, they mourned the loss of it because it was this wonderful green space. On the other hand, if you didn't live here in Cambridgeport and you didn't know the area, you didn't have such a positive view of the Pine Swamp. It was an artist named Washington Alston who married a Dana and moved to Cambridgeport, and he used to like to go and walk through the swamp. He was a romantic artist, so I think that spoke to him. But his friends would come to visit him and say, "What are you doing down here?" This was like the back of beyond to people. So I think that brings us up. And so Fort Washington, you know where Fort Washington is. So that was the edge of, that was where the river was. Where the railroad tracks are now, that was the river. And we have some wonderful old photos of kids sitting on the embankment along the river, and you could see the water beyond them. So if you go to Fort Washington and you read the signs about Washington and the fort there, just imagine that you're looking across the river at Boston Common. You could see the redcoats.
Wow.
Yeah. So I think I'll turn it over to Bob, and if you have any questions as we go along, we're both here.
So can you just say what was underwater? So Brookline Street towards MIT was swamp.
Yes.
And then from Lawrence Street.
Well, I would say like Brookline Street sort of ended, the original Brookline would end around Lawrence Street. And then below that, what's the rest of Brookline, was underwater. And most of what is now around the Charles River, that's made land. And certainly parts of southern Cambridgeport are also made land. So if your basement floods, now you understand why.
That's awesome. And if I just add a comment on that, because now Now, we're, of course, spending a lot of time thinking about climate change and preparedness planning, and when you look at a map of what used to be underwater in Cambridge, you could imagine that that's under threat in the future, but we're actually very fortunate on this side with the Charles River, because the dam controls the height of the water in the Charles River, and that dam is very high relative to what our expectations are about climate change, at least through 2070. So we're not concerned that the water is going to come all the way up to Brookline Street. It's a much bigger challenge in Alewife because in the Mystic River, but on this side, the concerns are not as great. There are places in Cambridgeport certainly that are low-lying that are a concern for like very intensive rainstorms, and all those maps are on our website if you want to look at them. But it's the dam really makes the difference.
Do you have any questions for Kit, Steve?
Yeah. I moved to Hamilton Street in 1960, mid-60s, and the neighbors were telling me about the nickname for Cambridgeport, Greasy Village. That came from the Big Fat and other things. And so I used to live in a MIT dorm, and when the wind blew out of the west, we could get all the smells.
That's right.
So when the wind came one direction, we get Big Fat. When it came from another direction, we get chocolate. So it's a rather interesting experience. And just tonight, I learned the impression of a former resident of Porter Square out Cambridgeport, back in the old days, maybe 50 years ago. It was a very tough place. And I had never equated that term tough with Cambridgeport, but you know, the kids were tough. It was blue collar. And so it was a quite different atmosphere than we would get today. But I would have to say we needed that toughness in the past, because this was the neighborhood that beat the Interbelt.
True.
So, and the Interbelt would have come right through this room. Right through this room. Those blocked it out. In 1972, city officials in their own report admitted that for 2 years they were uncoordinated in fighting the Interbelt, and they had to depend on neighbors to do the organizing. And guess where the neighbors came from? Cambridge. So I think this background was very important in how it changed over the years. And I just wanted to add this to
So what he was saying about the Greasy Village nickname, there was the Reardon Soap Factory, which was huge, was right next to to Fort Washington, and so it's the rendering of the animal fat that really makes the stink. But that's what soap is made from, among other things, is animal fat. So, not a pleasant job to have, I don't think.
For all of you young people, I want you to imagine the following. It's 1955, and coming across the BU Bridge, or the Cottage Farm Bridge as we used to refer to it, were these large trucks with open backs. Sticking out of the trucks were carcasses, and they were headed to Mr. Reardon's rendering plant. They also were heading to a couple of other places because soap was being manufactured in other parts of the city as well. And so if you really wanted to understand how soap was made, you really had a great opportunity to do that. Steve, of course, has left out a few other olfactory experiences that were characteristic of this part of the city, the eastern part of the city, because in addition to the wind coming from the west from the Reardon rendering plant, and the chocolate being manufactured at Necco and several other confectionery industries in East Cambridge. You also had the Boston Woven Hose American Built-Right Company, where they were vulcanizing rubber. And so at around 5 o'clock in the evening, when these factories were blowing off their effluent, you could experience the most extraordinary olfactory experience. You would have the grease from the rendering plants, the chocolate from the Daggett Chocolate Company, the smells of vulcanizing rubber, and there were also several other chemical plants in the area that also added to this wonderful perfume that we all inhaled in those days. The Environmental Protection Act had not yet been passed, but this part of the city has always had an enormous variety of industrial activities, and that in itself, I think, would be an entertaining thing for people in the neighborhood to realize and to learn more about. But one of the things that is interesting about the last 50 years is that in the 19th century, this part of the city grew both residentially for workers who were working in the various factories here. You had plants like Nabisco, you had plants like trying to think of a lot of warehousing. You had trucking companies here. You had the original Ford Motor Company who operated an assembly plant in 640 Memorial Drive, a vertical assembly plant. You had lots of things going on here, and many of the people who worked in these factories lived in the area, and much of the residential development, particularly the 3-deckers and 2-family houses, were essentially built to support that working population. Well, what happens during the Second World War is that all of these factories, many of them were converted to wartime activities, and they stopped producing for the civilian population. And so this area was very, very active and had employed lots of people. At the end of the war, you had the beginning of a significant change in the character of the economy of the city. And many of these old factories ceased to be efficient. The soap factory, we stopped making soap out of animal fats. Soap started to be manufactured from petroleum-based things. So not only did the Reardon company go out of business, but the largest company that manufactured soap, the Lever Brothers company, also began to scale down and ultimately left the city in the early 1950s. So what you had was the employment base for this city began to erode, and what was left were people who lived here, many of whom had been employed, and they sought other kinds of employment. But the city, this area of the neighborhood, the Cambridgeport neighborhood, was in the process of changing. The other thing about it is that the demography of the neighborhood was also changing. You had an infusion of population here over a relatively short period of time in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Lots of young workers, lots of immigrants, and so on. And they all aged at the same rate. And many of them purchased these 3-deckers, and you know what the typical arrangement was. One family would buy the house and rent the other 2 units and amortize the cost of the house that way. And they typically were members of the same family. So you had in the same buildings that were occupied by very, very large families. Today, those same units have been condominiumized, and they may be occupied by 1 or 2 or maybe 3 people, where they may have been occupied by 4, 5, or 6 people. So the population of this area in the 1950s, if you look at the 1950 census for the city of Cambridge, we were, I believe at that time, 125,000 people in the city. Excuse me, 1940. The population of the city started to decline as the employment base of the city began to decline. And if you look at this plan that Kit is just talking about, you'll see that a very substantial portion of the neighborhood wasn't in these industrial activities. Now, many of them survived for quite a long time, but many of them were abandoned, and the owners of these buildings began to have to rent these buildings for less and less money. That had some advantages as well as some disadvantages. One of the advantages was that space could be rented by young startup companies at very low prices. So a number of small companies that ultimately became famous started out in many of these old factory buildings here in Cambridgeport and East Cambridge before they got to a scale where they moved on and built new buildings on Route 128 and so on. So you had an evolution of this area and an evolution of the workforce that worked in these places. Do any of you own a KLH audio system? Anybody ever remember the KLH company? Okay. They started right here in Cambridgeport. They stayed here for quite a long time until the company moved to a different scale. And there were many, many of these companies that did that. But the one thing that the neighborhood has been threatened with for generations, all through this period, was transportation issues. And I'm going to ask Suzanne Rasmussen, who was kind enough to come along with us this evening, to tell you a little bit about the current state of the transportation challenges that the neighborhood faces.
Thank you, Bob. So if Bob's mistake was to accept a dinner invitation from Kathy, mine was to accept a meeting invitation 2 days ago. So bear with me if this is a bit of ad-libbing. But I did want to say I have a long-term experience with the city. I've been there for almost 25 years. But I also have a long-term experience with Cambridgeport because I've lived here since 1996. And I've lived on Pearl Street, on Prince Street, on Pleasant Street, and lately I jumped to the H, so now I'm on Hamilton Street. And I actually live in a converted factory. I believe they made dentures where I live. And of course I'm surrounded by the new Cambridgeport industry, which is biotech. So there's biotech to my right and biotech down the street and lots of biotech. So Cambridgeport is still a very heavily industrialized part of the city if you think about the number of jobs and certainly the economic output that comes out of our neighborhood. On Pearl Street, I did live directly across from the soap workers' cottage, and I was informed a long time ago that I lived in Greasy Village, so try to remember that. What I was going to do tonight was just talk about some things that are happening that are here and now that relate to transportation that may be of interest. And my understanding is that you've already heard about the I-90 Alston interchange projects. I'm not going to talk about that. And that you've already heard about the River Street projects. I'm not going to talk about that either. But there are some other things that are happening at the edges that are happening right now. So the first thing is the Grand Junction Pathway project. And if you follow what goes on at City Council, you'll know that for a very, very long time, there's been a very strong interest in creating a bike and pedestrian path along the Grand Junction Railroad corridor, which goes from, it comes underneath the BU Bridge and goes all the way up the east side of Cambridgeport, crosses Mass Ave, Main Street, Broadway, Cambridge Street, and disappears into Somerville, up near where the Millis River housing project is all the way up. And so we have been, since there was I think it was in 2000, there was a Green Ribbon Commission exercise with residents of Cambridge, all over Cambridge, to talk about open space and where would people like to see more open space and green space. And that corridor was identified at the time. And so we started working on trying to make that a reality. And it was really hard There was a lot of challenges because the city doesn't own the right of way. MIT owns a good portion of it, and the state of Massachusetts acquired the remainder. And there was little interest from either party to support this project. But I'm pleased to say that vehemence and spirit has won out, and that project is really advancing very rapidly now. The sort of big change that happened was that MIT, in return for some additional rights to develop in the Kendall Square area, granted the city the rights to all of their right-of-way, and also gave us a large chunk of money, $8.5 million, to realize the project. And the city had set aside $10 million to advance the project north of Binney Street. So we have accumulated almost $20 million to do the project, and we've obtained the right-of-way from MIT, and we're in conversations with the state to get their approval to permit the construction of the path to the degree that we need to be in their right-of-way. There are pieces that have actually already been built, and the Cambridge Redevelopment Authority has built a piece from Main Street to Broadway, and from Broadway to Binney is being built as part of mitigation funds from other projects in Kendall Square, so the city's building a park there that will also have the pathway segment. But we have now hired a design and construction consultant to develop the plans to do the entire project. So that has just kicked off, and we have advertised to get residents and other interested parties to be involved in an advisory committee that recently closed. We had an enormous amount of interest in serving, so we're going to be doing a lot of interviews. But so that will be a citizen-guided planning process. We expect that the state will grant us permission so long as we can guarantee them that there can be two-way passenger rail service, that there's enough room left in the corridor so they can continue to operate the freight trains they operate now, which are very infrequent, but in the future that there would be room for passenger rail service. So that's sort of part of the project, is to do a conceptual design of, not a final design, but just conceptual, to make sure that there can be that there is room for two-way passenger rail service along with the path. So ideally, at the end, we would be able to connect across the Charles River. So you know there's a bridge that goes underneath the VU Bridge that only has, there's room for 2 sets of tracks, but there's only 1 track right now. The idea would be to be able to have that bridge rebuilt somehow so that in the future you could actually cross right over. In the short term, we're looking to design this path so it can connect into the Paul Dudley White path along the river. So when you get to the end, you would be able to just cross and continue either east or west. To the north, we're hoping to connect with the Somerville Community Path, which is a path that then connects to the Minuteman that then gets you to Bedford. So we're hoping to, in the long run, to be able to connect to pathways on both sides and create this very large connected bike and pedestrian network. To the north, it's more technically challenging because there are buildings in the way, and the Somerville Community Path looks like it's going to be like high up in the air to accommodate the Green Line extension. So it's much more challenging, but we're asking our consultants to at least look at how could these connections happen. But the project is to build the entire path inside the Cambridge boundaries. It is, as you can imagine, and you know from Cambridgeport, it connects to so many things, like Lindstrom Field and the Morse School. And it will really revolutionize the ability for people of all ages and abilities to get connecting East Cambridge and the Kendall Square area in Cambridgeport. And I just say, like, one example I'd like to give is my daughter went to King Open on Cambridge Street when she was younger, and if that path had been there, she would have ridden her bike to school. But she either had to take a 45-minute bus ride, or at least 45 minutes before school start, or I had to drive her. And so it's a really, if you start looking at all the recreational areas along the whole length, and the retail areas and the institutions, there's so many destinations there. So we expect it to be really, like I said, revolutionizing in terms of like the connections between the eastern part and Cambridgeport of Cambridge. And something that happened more recently was that the business community is now really excited about this path as well. So it has a lot of momentum that we hope to bring to bear to make sure that MassDOT signs off on this idea of this path. And so it's one of those things that 15 years ago it was a dream and seemed like an endless uphill battle, and then all of a sudden, like, it's happening. So we expect the design process to continue through this year and next year, and then construction will happen after that. We have, of course, a detailed webpage on the Community Development Department's website, so you can follow along. And certainly all the meetings are open to the public. So, and maybe some of you have applied to be part of it. I don't know, but so that was the one project. Connected to that, I wanted to let you know that the state, so the Mass Department of Transportation, along with the MBTA, well, they're undertaking a lot of planning right now. So they have the Better Bus Project, which is to just look at short-term improvements to bus service in Cambridge. And I describe it sort of as a zero-sum game, because this is an exercise that does not involve new resources. So looking at the whole bus system, how can they move things around? So there are a lot of proposals that apply to Cambridge, and there's an upcoming meeting on that. And right off the top of my head, I have not forgotten when that meeting is, but there will be a meeting to discuss all of those changes. But they're also undertaking a long-range, full review of how to envision the Massachusetts MBTA commuter rail system for the future. So the future is meaning in 2040, where do we want to be with our commuter rail system? So I have been participating in an advisory committee on that project, and the project looks at, as I said, the whole system and how should it be different in the future. And there's so in Cambridge right now, the only commuter rail station we have is in Porter Square, but there is going to be an analysis that's part of this to looking at the Grand Junction. So we have the path, hopefully, in the next several years. In the long run, how could we envision having passenger service on the Grand Junction? And I should say this, the important thing to think about is forget diesel commuter rail trains. That is not what we're expecting to have in 2040. In 2040, the expectation is that it would be all electric, and that the trains would be quiet, they would be able to stop and start very quickly, so that much better acceleration, and powered by renewable energy. So we're not expecting to have the noise and the spewing of diesel or anything like that. So it's a completely different future in terms of the equipment itself. There are up to 8 different scenarios that will be looked at, and what the state is trying to do is to have a scenario that sort of, at least one scenario that satisfies every opinion. And you can imagine that when you're in this process, there are people that are in Worcester and they would like to have reverse commute, so lots of trains running with people that live in Cambridgeport who have PhDs in biotechnology, so they can go and work out, and so they can have great jobs out there too. And so, us from the cities, and the cities, the two cities that are represented are Cambridge and Boston, and we're like urban rail in the inner core, like lots of service, more like subway or light rail. So they're going to develop up to eight different scenarios. 3 of them we now know will look at Grand Junction service. So in one of them, the scenario is to run the Worcester line trains, and again, remember, not spewing diesel trains, more like light rail trains, up the Grand Junction, through to North Station, and this scenario imagines that the north-south rail link is built. So an underground connection that connects North Station with South Station. So you could take a train starting in Worcester and go all the way in, up through Cambridge, and connect down to the South Shore. So that scenario is obviously insanely expensive. So we said we would like to look at other scenarios, not just the one that is so expensive that it's hard to imagine. So the other 2 scenarios imagine what's called an urban shuttle that would connect West Station, and you've heard a lot about the I-90 project, so you know that there's it's being contemplated to have a rail stop near all the new development that Harvard is going to do, and it's going to be called West Station. So it's sort of almost like across from Nickerson Field in the EU area. And that would connect, in one scenario, it would just go to Kendall, and it would turn around and go back. So, and then in the other scenario, it would go to North Station and then go back. And there are challenges at North Station. It's physically constrained. You can't add any more width. So you can't have any more train platforms than there's room for. There's room for more than you experience today, but not much. So, but they're going to model all 3 versions of this. Right now, it only has a station at Kendall Square, but that's something that could be obviously talked about. So the other thing, there are things that are being sort of applied uniformly. So it's envisioned that it would be every 15 minutes, not like every hour, like much of commuter rail is now, and therefore not many people take it. So every 15 minutes, at least in the peak hour. And that it would be electric, and that all platforms would be accessible to anyone. So that's what's being. Those scenarios have been drawn up, and there's obviously I described 3, so there's at least 4, maybe 5 others. There will be a public meeting on March the 5th at 10 Park Plaza in Boston, the Transportation Building. There will only be 1 public meeting, so us asking for a meeting in Cambridge is not going to happen because it is the only meeting for the entire system. And the argument is, well, the commuter rail goes into downtown Boston, so everybody can easily get here, right? So the meeting is from 4:30 to 7 p.m. and there's a presentation. It's an open house, but at 5:30 p.m. there's a presentation. It's very easy to look at all this information. If you Google Rail Vision MBTA, you'll see the website. Absolutely every piece of paper all the presentations, everything are all there, so you can look at it. But remember again, this is not next week, not next year. It's a very long range thinking. But I think it could, again, it's another possibility of sort of dramatically changing the transit service that's available in the city. So I think those are like the kind of key things that are happening right now.
What about the red line?
So the red line is in luck because the MBTA Fiscal Control Management Board decided maybe a year ago that they would authorize MBTA investing in all new Red Line cars. So and all new Orange Line cars. So the Red Line and the Orange Line train sets will all be replaced. And they are actually have started building them. So they're being manufactured in China, but they're being assembled in Springfield. They built an assembly plant in Springfield to get all the trains assembled. So you'll start. They just ran some tests over in the seaport. So they have the first ones are now coming off the assembly line, and they're starting to test them. So I think it's. Can it be 20? No, I can't remember. Is it into the, maybe it's like 2021 or something, where they'll all be replaced. And what's terrific about that is that the technology that's included in all new train sets means that they can run with much closer spacing than the trains we experience today. And they will not fail constantly like the trains we have today. And it's kind of ironic, actually, the oldest train sets are better off than the second oldest because they've been refurbished more recently. So it's actually not the very oldest ones that are the worst, it's the second oldest ones. But once the train sets start running more closely spaced, what's it called? The headways will decrease, and we will see much more capacity. That's what the word I was looking for. The capacity is going to be increased by as much as 50%. So it will really improve. It should really decrease the congestion that we're experiencing now quite a lot. So
That is great news.
yes. So you'll start seeing them being phased in over time, and but they've all been authorized, and so the whole full replacement is on schedule.
Okay, thank you very much, Suzanne. Questions?
Yeah. Just some additions on the Red Line. By the MBTA's own numbers, they can't run the trains on time. Sometimes they're crowded, sometimes they're not, sometimes you have to wait a long time. Very inefficient. If they ran the trains on time, the MBTA numbers say they could get 50% more capacity. With the existing fleet, don't buy any more cars, okay? Get the trains to run on time, buy new cars, and you've got a vastly improved MBTA. That should be #1 priority for the city of Cambridge to talk about transportation. Vital improvement for the city, and you're not set up to do it. It needs outside pressure to change the whole atmosphere. Okay. But the potential for improvement, the Green Line too, even more. That's part of Cambridge too in our transportation. 1/3 of Cambridgeport closer to the Green Line than we are to the Red Line. So put both of those lines #1 priority and see that that's the real service improvement that everybody in this room can use.
Thanks, Steve. Are there other questions for Suzanne?
Well, I'm curious about the Grand Junction tracks. You say that they're being used, but not that often, and do you know who uses them and what for?
Yep. So the primary use is actually the MBTA, because what they're doing is if you go over the bridge over to Charlestown, you'll see, like, if you look down to the left, there's this like massive blue thing with a purple stripe on. That's the Boston Engine Terminal. That's where they do all the repairs of the trains. And so when you have any train that needs repair, the only way to get to the Boston Engine Terminal from the south is to come up the Grand Junction. So you'll see trains being moved to go to the Boston Engine Terminal. The MBTA also sometimes moves cars that they have on the South Shore that they want to use on the North Shore. So sometimes they just move them to get up to the northern system. There were trains running over to the Chelsea Produce Market. My understanding is that that's actually pretty much disappeared now. And one of the things that's going to happen when the I-90 project starts is that the Grand Junction will be not used, because all the bridges and things that have to be rebuilt means that you can't access the Grand Junction. So the Grand Junction will become unused for several years, and depending on what final plan is chosen, the number of years is up in the air, but there will be a very long time when it will be shut down.
Okay, thank you very much, Suzanne. Okay, we want to leave time for questions and observations, so let me swing back to kind of a historical perspective and tell you a little bit about my impressions of how the neighborhood has changed over the last 50 years. First of all, I think for those of you who haven't seen it, there is a terrific set of materials that the Community Development Department has prepared over the last couple of decades that are on the website, and I think we'll put them on the neighborhood website as well. And they really represent a significant amount of information that I think anyone resident in the neighborhood ought to have a chance to look at and digest, and perhaps have questions about things that were proposed that haven't yet been done, and if there are ways that they might want to get behind certain things, it would give them an opportunity to be well informed about them. And secondly, I think the Historic Commission has also done a very interesting job, starting back in the 60s when they published a series of books on Cambridge. Cambridgeport is one of the neighborhoods that, if you haven't seen that book, they're still available from the MIT Press. It's something that you might find very interesting. You might find your own house in that book, and but it'll tell you all about Greasy Village and all the other things. One of the other things, incidentally, that existed back in those days, actually at an earlier time, is that Cambridgeport was one of the first places in this country where telescopes were built over on the corner of Brookline Street and Memorial Drive. There was an important telescope manufacturing establishment there for many years. So, but let me just go back to some of the things I'd like to share with you. One of the things I wanted to point out is that you currently are served by a variety of public and private services. There are shopping facilities here on Memorial Drive. There are things like Trader Joe's and Whole Foods and so on and so forth. Back in 1950, they didn't exist. And what really was the central shopping facility for the city of Cambridge was Central Square. And in Central Square, you found everything from furniture stores, department stores, shoe stores, food stores, every kind of normal shopping facility that you would find in a community. It served the entire Cambridge community, and Cambridgeport, of course, had very significant access to it. It also was a time when there were many fewer automobiles in this city. The kinds of people that lived here in Cambridgeport didn't have at that point, particularly right after the war, it didn't have access to automobiles. So public transportation was an important part of the way they got around. Many of the people who worked in this area walked to or took the bus, or originally the trolley car that ran down Brookline Street to Central Square to get on the other forms of transportation, the Red Line and so on. Many of you may not know that the Red Line terminated in Harvard Square until the early 80s. So Cambridgeport and Central Square were tied together in a much tighter way than they are today, or have been over this last period of time. One of the things that occurred in the 50s is that began to change. Fresh Pond Shopping Center was built out in West Cambridge, began to draw people from West Cambridge to new shopping areas there. The area along Memorial Drive was opened by the Metropolitan District Commission at that time. They began to introduce curb cuts in the parkway, which had not been there before, to encourage commercial development of some of the sites that you see now. So what you see there today is not what was there 50, 60 years ago. One of the things that was there, which I have sort of personal experiences with, how many of you have ever been to a California-type drive-in hamburger place where you drove your car in and somebody came out and put a table on your car and you could try hamburgers and shakes and so on and so forth? Well, there used to be one where the Micro Center is now, actually just a little between Micro Center and Trader Joe's.
Big Boys?
Hmm?
Was that Big Boys? Is that what it was called?
It might have been, yeah, I don't remember the name, I just remember the people who brought the hamburgers. At the time I was courting my wife, so I mean, I was more interested in her reactions. But there were two drive-ins in Cambridge. One was that one, and the other one was the theater out at Fresh Pond, where the big substation is now. But you could bring a car full of family and or friends and so on, and for a relatively small amount of money, see movies outdoors in that area. But the thing about what was happening here was that as these changes occurred, as competing commercial facilities began to develop in other parts of the city, you began to see the decline of Central Square. And as Central Square became less attractive, as people shopped there less, the level of services and the kind of people that lived in the area and that shopped in the area began to change. But other things were happening in the neighborhood as well. Do any of you remember when the Morse School was not there? And when that was part of the green space for this area? One of the things that Cambridge was pressured about was when they needed to build new schools, they really didn't have adequate sites that were free of, in terms of being able to be not converted from existing parkland and recreational space. So one of the things that's happened in Cambridgeport over the years is that there used to be more green space in some areas, and that's actually declined. So in fact, if you look at a very interesting map that the CDD provides, that talks about the available open space per density of population, you'll see that Cambridgeport is not terribly well served given the size of the population. So one of the things that people need to think about is not only continue the great work that Kathy and the rest of you have been doing on Magazine Beach, but recognizing that as the population comes back and starts to grow again, that you have provided adequate recreation and green space for the community that's coming. There are parts of the city that have considerably more with the same population, and so it'll be intriguing to see whether you can come up with interesting ideas about how to expand the recreation spaces for the area. One of the things that Steve mentioned is that this neighborhood really was under the kind of in stasis for well over almost 2 decades. Starting in the mid-50s, actually starting in the early 50s, when the federal government passed the Interstate Defense Highway Act and began to introduce the possibility of states being able to have their highways paid for 90% by the federal government, Massachusetts elected to propose this Interbelt Highway. There had been a proposal for a much smaller highway arrangement back before the Second World War, but the federal standards for these highways were considerably larger. So by the time we got to the 1950s, when the state's consultants began to propose alternative sites for a circumferential highway that would connect all of the radial routes that would come into the city, it had grown to 8 lanes and took up an enormous amount of space. They had proposed 5 routes through the city of Cambridge, and ultimately they proposed to build the highway right through this neighborhood. So that struggle went on for many years. I think the leadership that came out of this neighborhood was really quite astounding, and together with others who also participated in various ways, fortunately, the irrationality of building a highway here, and not only here but in other parts of the metropolitan area, became apparent to the then Governor Sargent, and he elected to eliminate that from the state's highway plan. There's no question that all of the efforts that people in this neighborhood made to defeat that highway demonstrated that when this neighborhood got itself behind something and focused its attention on defeating something or being creative about something, it could be very effective. Where it is passive, then very little happens, except where some crisis emerges. And I would say that the real lesson to be learned from the experience of the Interbelt Highway is that you need to pay attention. You need to not think that somebody else is thinking about the problems. You need to understand what the implications of any major public works are going to be, and you need to look at not only the first effect, but also the second and third effect of any significant development that's occurring. Now, it's not likely, other than things like the Grand Junction, which Suzanne has just shared with us, but there are going to be fairly major developments in this area that will emerge out of the large land holdings of people that are already operate in this area, and one wants to be very attentive to what those are, or what the potential for not only their interests but also the neighborhood interests are. So but let me hop back a little bit and tell you that what was happening in the 50s is that the whole city was beginning to change in terms of its population and so on. One of the things that was happening was that the people who had purchased houses in this area in the early parts of the 20th century were aging. Every day they were getting older. In the 1960s, you could begin to see that change occur. Their children were not staying in Cambridge. They had begun to move out to suburbs like Arlington, Lexington, Medford, and so on. They elected not to remain in Cambridge. They could get their own single-family house with FHA mortgages and veterans mortgages and so on. And so that pattern began. People began to have access to more automobiles, and so you began to see the diversion of what would have been families that remained here actually begin to move out. The housing frequently was then rented to people. For instance, in those days, there was relatively little student housing at MIT, and so many of the students at MIT would live in rooming houses or in apartments in many of the areas that had formerly been occupied by people that worked here in the city. The current chairman of the MIT Corporation, Bob Millard, shared with me his, he was quite poor when he came here as a student. He's not poor now, but he was then. He regaled me with his experiences. He came here and lived in a dormitory for 1 year and then found it much more inexpensive to find an apartment here in Cambridgeport to complete his studies. He studied architecture. So he was an example of the way people, lots of students in those days, of course there were fewer students, but they came here and found it easy to find accommodations in that particular period of time. That began to change significantly in the 1960s. The country was changing. As many of you remember, in the late 60s, during the Vietnam era, Cambridge became kind of hippieville, or one of the hippievilles of the country, and the neighborhood was significantly impacted by that change in population and their ability to find inexpensive housing. But they also, the result was they began to push other people out. So in the late 60s and early 70s, in fact, in 1970, we had established here in Cambridge something called the Cambridge Economic Opportunity Committee. One of the things they did was to try to advocate for underrepresented people and the elderly, and they held a housing convention which essentially demanded that the city needed to do much more for elderly housing, or the elders in the city who were being pushed out, they felt, by this growing population that was not native to the community or involved in ways that were more permanent. That resulted in several interesting developments, one of which was the building we're sitting at. A number of people stepped forward to do things to try to mitigate that problem. MIT undertook to build 3 elderly housing projects, of which the LBJ was one. Miller's River was the second, and the third one in North Cambridge, the Burns. So in a sense, each time, almost every decade, there is a housing crisis in Cambridge. In 1960, when I came to work at MIT, there was a Citizens Advisory Committee, and it had a housing subcommittee. And what was the principal issue then? We needed more housing. 1970 was the same story. 1980 is the same story. 1990, and this year, as you can see, is again the same thing. The capacity of the city to deal with this problem has varied over time. A great deal has been done, but one of the things that the city has not really quite effectively addressed is how big should the city be? Should we go back to being a city of 125,000? Should we be, should the neighborhood go back to being what it was in 1970, 15,000? It's now 9,000. If you build more facilities and you build more housing, what are the responsibilities for providing adequate public services and public facilities for that additional population? Who should build that? Who should pay for it? Who should maintain it? All of those kinds of questions are things that have been faced before. Sometimes they were addressed effectively, sometimes not, and the result is the neighborhoods have had to make do with whatever they had. And you've seen that to some degree here in Cambridgeport. In 1970, one of the major changes in the neighborhood was the development of University Park. The Simplex Wire and Cable Company, like many others in late 1969, was seduced by the state of Maine to move there with tax incentives, and so they put their property on the market. MIT, having had a rather successful relationship with the city of Cambridge when we started Technology Square in 1960, felt that this was another opportunity to help build the economy of the city, and to begin to develop a project that was unlike Technology Square, which was exclusively for office buildings and commercial space, a mixed-use project in which there would be housing and retail services, hotels, as well as commercial space for new companies. That was unusual. Cambridge had not done that before, and it also represented an opportunity to essentially have both the neighborhood played a very significant role in shaping the character of that development. With all its imperfections, it is considerably more varied and more effective than many other projects which have been developed in the city, at least in my opinion, in recent years. So the question that you need to ask yourself is, if the neighborhood could bring itself together and focus on negotiating with an institution and a major developer and the city in an earlier time, does it have the capacity, or can it build the capacity and sustain it to deal with future projects which will influence the character and spirit of the neighborhood? You've done it before. The question is whether you can do it again. There have been also times when the neighborhood did not face up to the opportunities that came. For instance, one of my disappointments is that when we did University Park, one of the innovative things that was done was we, with the city, created the transfer of development rights section of the zoning ordinance. Now that only appears to be available here in Cambridgeport, but basically it allowed MIT to shift student housing from the site that was to be on Pacific Street to an area across the street and create a park that is really only half a park. And our hope was that the city and the neighborhood would press for the acquisition of the remaining pieces of that block so that the neighborhood would end up with a whole block park instead of just half a park. Now that was proposed by one of the studies that the Community Development Department and the neighborhood developed in earlier times, but it's an example of where the neighborhood pressing on the city council, on the city manager, ensuring that the capital development, the capital budget of the city carries funds to and has the will to execute those kinds of projects was not there. You didn't take it all the way around the bases and hit a home run. Not that people didn't try, but it's within your power to do that if you really want to accomplish some of the things that you have said that you want to accomplish. And my advice to you is that where you were focused, where you stuck with it, you were able to get things done. In a sense, you're demonstrating that again in the magazine Beach project. So I looked recently at the list of things that the Community Development Department studies for the area have said were things that were desired by the neighborhood and where they stood in the priority lists and so on. But there's an old saying here that if you don't ask, you don't get. And these are examples of where you have to be a focused community. You have to determine what's important to you. And sometimes you may not be the personal beneficiary, but the neighborhood will, and you have to think about doing that. You will be under a lot of pressure for the development of areas such as the redevelopment of the site that's on Memorial Drive where Trader Joe's and the Micro Center is now. That's the owner of that property certainly will try to maximize the return on their investment. Your job is to make sure that whatever is done there has sufficient and the appropriate community benefits to make it worthwhile for the neighborhood as well as for the developer. And the same thing is true with
Is there a
property.
new owner? Can you say more about what's happening there?
Well, I think Kathy can
Yeah, so Kimco purchased it, I think, 3 years ago with a bunch of other plazas. They specialize in shopping plazas. And they're hoping to develop there in the next maybe 5 years. We're lucky Daniel Wolf is here from Cambridge Community Development. Yeah, they presented twice to Cambridge Community Development, but they've been pushed back. They haven't presented things that the CCD representing us felt we would want. We didn't want biotech there, and we didn't want very, very dense residential there. So I had asked the head of development there about whether he wanted to present to the neighborhood in September, and he said, we're just not ready. I think
It's not going to stay Trader Joe's and Micro Center, that's what you're saying?
I think it'll become, I think they have the right to go up to 4 or 5 stories, right? Currently, and apparently Trader Joe's and Micro Center have long-term leases. So I think that what they would do is they might put residential above first floor commercial. But as soon as I hear anything about this, and Cambridge Community Development has said they'll let the neighborhood know. If they hear back from Kimco, we'll talk about it.
We'll stop it.
Yeah, well, something is gonna happen. They have the right to do something there, right?
There's a street there too, a city street.
No name, no name's Riverside. No, it's
No one has a
Riverside.
name.
Yeah,
Riverside.
in fact, at the end of this, I will tell you about that street that stopped the Super Stop and Shop.
Oh,
And
I know.
and the high rise. Alice Wolf called me and told me we had the opportunity to squash the deal. And then we negotiated with Super Stop and everyone had their money.
Well, the point I think to be made here is that some neighborhoods in the city have waited until a developer makes a proposal. Some neighborhoods in the city have said, we don't want to do that. We don't want to just be responders. We want to take the initiative. One of the things that I think that one of the CDD reports suggested was that there be, in fact, independent studies of the development of that area that essentially would inform the kinds of things that you would like to support rather than simply responding to somebody else's proposal. That's the kind of thing I think that the neighborhood, if it does that, can in fact insert some very creative solutions to the problem. East Cambridge has done that several times. So it's not an unknown in the community. So that the original development of the biomed area was the product of people in the East Cambridge neighborhood working with the developer, and sometimes in a not very pleasant way, but ultimately an effective way to ensure that the neighborhood got things out of that project that were important to the neighborhood. Everybody now enjoys those things, and everybody takes credit for them. So you really have to gird your loins, so to speak, and realize that you're ultimately doing good for everybody, including the developer. You know, the skating rink in Kendall Square is now something that the owners of that property celebrate all the time, and they believe it's an important part of their sales package to their tenants and so on. They were forced to build a skating rink by the neighborhood. The same thing with the Alexandria development along Binney Street and so on. The 2-acre park, Roger Street Park, and the Foundry building were part of the price for getting the neighborhood's support for much of the zoning development that was developed for their purposes, and the increased density and limitations on height and so on were negotiated with that that intent, to make sure that the neighborhood got things out of that major and very valuable site that would be of long-lasting value to everybody, not just to the neighborhood, but to everybody in that area. And I think you have the same opportunity. Ultimately, the cost of those benefits are passed on. One of the things that you should realize is that where a developer contributes something to the public good, it may often be treated like a charitable contribution. So if they tell you they can't afford it, then it's something that you can begin to question and you can begin to press on. So it isn't always a question of whether they can afford something or not. And it depends on what you think the right balance is. And working with your staff and community development, you can do your own pro formas and you can look at your own way of thinking about the way property can be developed. You don't have to always be on the responding end of a project. That certainly is going to be true with respect to additional developments in Central Square that impinge on the Cambridgeport side of the street. You see what's happened on the other side of Massachusetts Avenue. You also should be aware that there is a consolidation of real estate going on in the Central Square area with outside development companies assembling property there that they wish to maximize development. They look at some of the things which have already been approved and they assume they can do the same thing. The question is, how do you feel about that? What are your expectations about the opportunities for having people who are developing in the city make more significant contributions to the welfare of the neighborhood? And that can come in many forms. It doesn't have to come just in physical form. One of the things that every neighborhood needs is resources to be able to retain their own services or to supplement the services that the city supplies. You may even at some point believe that you should, because you're already a 501c3 establishment, you can become a community development agency. I mean, you can become your own development entity because you already have the legal authority to do that. If you're not familiar with that, one of the things you might do is talk with the people, for instance, in the Fenway, who are a neighborhood association that do some very interesting things with developers over there. Yes, this question.
It's not a question, it's sort of a long comment. I appreciate all your historical comments to us, and they were really interesting. But I think you might also like to have the historical perspective of somebody who's lived in Cambridgeport and whose kids grew up here and who was very active in organizing the neighborhood. I mean, Kathy was very active. The Ward 5 Democratic Committee was part of all this. We had, before the committee got active in the 80s, we had all the neighborhood organizations, the PTOs, the community schools. Do you remember who else was in the Cambridge? There were 9 local Cambridgeport groups that used to meet monthly to talk about development and to talk about issues for the neighborhood, which was called the Cambridgeport Alliance. And then after that, when MIT bought the Simplex Steering Committee, the Simplex land, the Simplex Steering Committee formed. It created a whole process of neighbors meeting in small groups. We had about over 100 people meeting in small groups in Cambridgeport to determine what we wanted as priorities for the neighborhood, because we could see the development coming in. We met, we came up with a list of, I think, 8 priorities. Hopefully you can help me on this. Number 1, won't surprise you, is affordable housing. factories or other jobs for working class people, because this was a working class neighborhood. This was not a professional neighborhood. We wanted small stores, local stores. I don't remember them anymore. Do you remember them,
No,
Kathy?
because I came just after the beginning of this.
Oh, okay. Anyway, there were 8 priorities. We negotiated with MIT. The reason that Auburn Court exists, the mixed income housing that's up on Auburn Street and Brookline Street, is because the Simplex Steering Committee forced MIT to build it. The reason that park is there is because the city removed, when it was voted on at the zoning committee, at the zoning board, the city removed a neighborhood representative the night before so that that person would not be voting on it and put in an MIT-sponsored person, which is why the park is in MIT land and not in the neighborhood. It was originally scheduled to be in the neighborhood. So people have to understand it is not easy to fight these people, but you have to do it, and if you get together, you can, and if you determine what your priorities are, there's no reason why we can't do it. And one of the fears I've had over this Grand Junction thing is that eventually it's going to be the inner belt with cars. And I think people should think about that. And the train, having train commuter rail here, we've already had this argument with the state, and they didn't do it because the neighborhood came out and fought against it. There are 6 streets before you leave Cambridge that the railroad the train would have to stop at, or else run over people. And it's just not feasible in this neighborhood to have commuter rail going through. Anyway, the whole thing is we fought through the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. You know, they got rid of rent control, so MIT was able to gentrify the neighborhood. They slowly bought up lots of parts of Cambridgeport, and then the biggest thing is that we got, I'm sure you've heard about it other places, that they change where people can, how the voting is set up. We used to have a big Cambridgeport voting area. Now it was split in half, and the other half got the dorms. What used to be Ward 5 is now mostly dorms and some residents. And that really, the students don't vote. And it really weakened our power to fight things because they did that. And I will just say that the year coming up is when they will in 2020, they will redo, the election commission will redo that. And we all need to be there to make sure we get our people back. Kathy, who used to be in Ward 5, got
Bumped to Ward 4.
right from that.
Thank you. I think your points are well taken. I think you should continue to carry the water and be informed and effective citizens. I think there's going to be lots of challenges in the neighborhood in the coming years, and the important thing is to be informed, hopefully accurately, so that everybody knows the same thing and sees it the same way. But I think the important thing is to have a clear picture of what you want to accomplish, and that way I think you actually help everybody, not just the people that are here today, but people that are going to be here in the future. I don't want to take any more time other than to say that I think many of you who have lived here for a while know what all the demographic and physical changes have occurred within the neighborhood, within the existing buildings in the neighborhood. Churches have been turned into condominiums and so on.
Mike, use the mic.
Oh, sorry. it never occurred to me that the principal Catholic church in the middle of this neighborhood would ever disappear. Having helped the pastor of that church several times with his heating system, I can tell you he believed it would be there forever. But the important thing is that you all have a sense of what is needed in this community. Also, I think you should be open to the fact that the community will continually change. It may have been a working class community at one point in its career. It has been changing slowly and developing to accommodate other kinds of people, all of whom have the same love and affection for the neighborhood. So I think the important thing is to think about what you want to occur in the future. The number of families that live here and who are raising children here are a key part of the character and the characteristic of this neighborhood. Do you want that to remain the same? Do you want to expand those opportunities? Do you want to diminish them? Do you believe that the kind of housing that should be built here should increase the family use of the area, or is that not important to you? There are all sorts of ideas about how MIT should use the land resources that they own. They were designated as far back as the 1970s for residential purposes. There are others now who have different ideas about how that land should be used. I think you have an obligation, if you are interested in ensuring that this neighborhood will retain its residential characteristics, to speak up and to be articulate about that, and also to be fair, because the universities do have an important function to perform, but they also have obligations, and most of the time it's useful, in fact it's extremely useful, for the neighborhood to articulate what they believe those obligations are, because university leadership changes on a regular basis, and one generation may not remember what the last one did. I gave Kathy a letter written by President Howard Johnson, who was president at the time we acquired the Simplex property, that articulated what MIT's goals were for that development and their relationship with the surrounding community. I think you want to, many of you will have a chance to see that if you've forgotten it. And the important thing is that he and those of us who worked on those projects were very conscious of what our responsibilities were to the neighborhood. And while we didn't always agree with everybody, because it was a very contentious time and people had different ideas, that's quite natural in a neighborhood. The important thing is for you to think clearly and fairly about what you believe ought to happen. And also, there's a lot of imagination and a lot of creativity in this neighborhood that doesn't get channeled into the support of neighborhood objectives. One of the things I asked Kathy was, did we know how many architects live in this neighborhood? How many city planners live in this neighborhood? How many lawyers live in this neighborhood? How many engineers live in this neighborhood? People that you should be able to call on for support, for analysis of projects, for new ideas about things that could be done in a different way that be more effective. Where neighborhoods have done that, they have been able to accomplish great things. So I would urge you to explore those kinds of things, to engage more people in the process, and particularly younger members of the community, so that they feel they have an investment that they can exploit for years to come and raise their families here and so on, or simply live here in a comfortable setting. I want to make sure we have lots of time to have other people speak up and talk about their interests and their concerns about the neighborhood, or what they would like to see. So why don't I stop here now, and we can pass the microphone around, or you can just speak up. Kathy. Carol, excuse me.
I just wanted to, can you hear me? No.
If you'd like to.
The microphone will really reach you.
Let's see here. Yeah, there you go. Okay.
I just wanted to mention one thing that was dramatic, and that is rent control.
Yeah.
Rent control was the reason we bought our house, because we were renters, and the landlord who lived across the street didn't want to own a house that was subject to rent control, and so he sold it to us. He was the Greek Orthodox priest, Metaxas, of the church up the street. He was also the chaplain of the police department, and he was the Greek teacher in the school, and his wife had a bakery in the basement, and so forth. Anyway, rent control was adopted in 1971, and the neighborhood took a dive. It became run down, and it wasn't, and I'm not making a case for or against rent control, but it's an interesting aspect of Cambridgeport's resurrection that it started to thrive again after that period, and it could be economic issues as well.
Harold, you might mention the Stop and Shop.
Oh yeah, and the Stop and Shop, I started to mention that deal for Stop and Shop to become a super Stop and Shop, which would have taken over the whole Micro Center lot and the Trader Joe's, that whole development area, was objected to by many surrounding neighbors at the time. But and the city adopted the city passed and approved the sale of Riverside Street, the street that L's around the Micro Center, and it was a done deal except for the fact that 5 modest conditions were a part of that sale agreement. Things like not constructing at night and putting up signage, and really nothing conditions. And Alice Wolf, so it was a done deal except that Stop and Shop objected to those conditions. So there was another city council meeting at which Alice Wolf called and told me, you might have a chance to nix this. And we got the neighborhood out at that time. And Stop and Shop would not cave, and the deal fell through. At that point, they started negotiating with the neighborhood. And I think Dennis Carlone helped the negotiation, and we had negotiated that whole, that Stop and Shop would build a super Stop and Shop, but it would be not a cookie cutter one. It would be a design with input from the neighborhood. And 4 or 5 neighbors did not buy into that. And so the lawsuits that were threatened and the expense and delay, I'm not going to say the word. Kathy once scolded me, so we will just say the deal fell through. Do you remember that? The deal fell through, and so in that case, the neighborhood did not work together. It was one side against the other, which was a very unhappy occurrence. So we, I hope, will communicate with Kathy and Cambridgeport Neighborhood Association, like East Cambridge planning team has done for years with some success. Although they are in big, they're really oppressed by development over there. We are lucky.
Thank you.
Bob, I was just wondering, my name is Rachel.
Hi, Rachel.
I was just wondering, when you were talking earlier about knowing the effects of a particular planning.
Rachel, can you speak up?
Sure. So, my question is about Bob's comment from earlier, that to really get to know a project, to also understand the first degree, second degree, and third degree impacts. So I think depending on what our fields, industries are, those words could mean different, could have different definitions. So I was wondering in this case about urban planning or zoning or any other example you could think of that could help us understand what you mean by first, second, third.
Sure.
Would be helpful.
Let me give you two examples. In 1962, we went through a revision of the zoning ordinance. In those days, the zoning ordinance was very simple. It was in a very small 8.5 by 11 booklet. It had 16 pages. The one now is this thick. But it made some significant changes in the way in which the city's land was zoned. One of the things it did in this neighborhood was that it allowed for an increase in density by changing classification with respect to some of the residential areas. One outcome of that, the expectation was that there wouldn't have been any significant changes here. People would have been able to add maybe an addition to a house or things like that. That was the intent of adjusting the provision. What actually happened was that people, as they saw the opportunities for developing rental housing, came in, bought one or two adjacent three-deckers, tore them down, and built a block of red brick, and you probably have seen them here in the neighborhood, red brick apartment houses for a very different kind of population. The second order, so the first order development was suddenly you have a different kind of development. You go from family housing to essentially much smaller units. So what was maybe 6 units suddenly becomes 8 or 10 units of a smaller dimension. And with those came people who had automobiles. So suddenly the parking space on all the surrounding streets suddenly disappeared because there were all sorts of new people who were bringing their cars in, who were living in these little apartments. And that's what I mean when you look at change in the zoning ordinance. You really need to understand what the implications of each change might be. And very often there are examples in the city where it's already happened, or in other places, and you can determine that. Then thirdly, each time you increase the population of an area, you have to believe that each of those people, new people, will make demands for public services. The question is what should those services be? What will that population be? What will the housing types be that will be encouraged by a particular change in the zoning ordinance? Will the city encourage large units? Will they encourage small units? What are the implications for the occupancy of that building type? And what services will those kinds of people require? In other words, will there be a demand for more school space, or will there be a demand for more of something else? Now, most of those things are actually quite straightforward if you think them through, and you can get help from the city staff to help explain, how to calculate what those things are. But you can actually have a checklist to say, if we do this, what are the implications for A, B, C, and D? That way you can present a much more rational analysis of what you believe the impact will be. Conversely, you can use that in reverse and say, these are the things we believe that the neighborhood already needs because it doesn't have enough of them now. To some degree, you've already done that in some of the earlier studies, but you need to calculate what the implications would be. Let me give you a specific example. Let's say the area we were just talking about here on Memorial Drive. Let's say we encourage that developer to add a significant amount of residential development over and above what their primary interest is. The question is, how much housing? Who will live there? What will the implications of that be? Now, you do have an example of that just down the street next to the Whole Foods project. Back in the 60s or early 70s, a developer built that apartment house over the gasoline stations and so on.
Right, 808.
Right, at 808. Now, there was no public improvements or no public facilities created until several years later when the Houghton Mifflin Company went out in the market, and there was a city councilor from this neighborhood who worked hard to essentially make the developer provide the park that you now see across the street. But it didn't come as a result of the housing project. It wasn't part of that package. The city didn't require a commitment of resources to help support all of those people that were going to be living there. Fortunately, and almost by accident, you had the opportunity to do that, and fortunately you had people in a leadership position who were willing to essentially push hard to create that park. Imagine what it would be like if that park simply had another building on it. That's the kind of thing that you can do, and you can do that with the help of city staff, but you have to ask the questions.
But I think we also need to know when it's gonna happen, because I mentioned, I don't know how many months ago, in my neighborhood, something's happening here in the city, because Trader Joe's light was out in the parking lot, and people, it was dark there at night, and I went and spoke to them about it, and they said nothing, so I called the guy, and I got the guy that owns the thing, and he said, "What are you calling me for?" I said, "Your name and your number was on the board, so I need to have you fix
Well,
this
good for
light."
you. Good for
And
you.
so
Don't
he said,
stop.
"Well, I will push you through this." And then I said to myself, I heard something about an apartment building. Oh no, that's not gonna happen. We need to know, and I think whether it's by design or not, that people are holding these things back from us about what is going on. We learn about it like the last minute, that something's happening. So I agree, we have to be proactive, but if we don't know till the end date, it's like,
Well,
what
I
do we
think
do?
my point really was you don't wait
But I mean, if
for
we
the end
don't
date.
know about it.
You begin to work with the people who can help you to do that now. If you have a point of view about
Well,
how
now we
you,
know about it,
yeah,
so-
but that goes for any site in the neighborhood which has development potential. The other thing you need to pay attention to is there may be changes in zoning, and one of the things people should remember, and I think you've all taken away one of the zoning maps. Chapter 40A, which is essentially enables cities to create zoning and land use discipline for a particular area, is essentially an allocation of value. So that if the city zones a piece of property for one number, it has a certain value to the owner. If they increase that number, it has a different value to the owner. It's taxed at a different level, but it also has a development potential of a different value. So you have to be very careful about when you see significant changes occurring, because what you're doing is increasing or decreasing value. And then you need to be able to have people who can help you calculate what the implications of that are. Now, it's not very hard to do that, although you wouldn't normally find that at the local grocery store. But you can find people who will help, probably people in this neighborhood. In fact, I know that there are people in this neighborhood who are in that business and who should be recruited to help understand what the implications of every site in the neighborhood which has a development potential, what it could be used for, what its value would be developed under the current zoning, and also what it might be used for and developed for if zoning changed. So again, it takes some initiative, but you have the resources both from the public sector and from your own community to help you understand, what essentially what you'd like to see next door or wherever the sites are that you're thinking about. Steve.
I think many of us here feel a basic tension between wanting to see change and yet wanting to see preservation at the same time. It's a very basic tension here. And we look around at our neighborhood and seeing buildings stripped down, you know, raised up, jacked up, and gentrified was the name that was used. I use the word yuppification, all right? It's a changing that's going on. And it's not being done by the planners, it's being done by the marketplace, you see. 50 years ago, what was happening is the planners were trying to force highways on us and urban renewal in order to get rid of the poor people, okay? Now they don't have to do that, they use the market. So in a sense, we've got to find a way to have zoning and planning so we can control the excesses of the marketplace. So we have a neighborhood that we preserve and that we like, you see. So I think that's our challenge. And it's a challenge for the planners to come up with that.
Yeah. Well, I think planners are creatures of the public ethos. They have very challenging positions because they're pushed in many directions by the political processes in the city. I've lived with 4 or 5 city managers over the time I've lived here. Some were very passive and quiet and left all the key policy decisions to the city council and its leadership. Others were very active and determined to essentially shape the character of the city in the whatever image they happen to have. So I think it's incumbent on the residents, particularly people like yourselves who have capacity and so on, to help the staff of the city understand that that you represent political value. You all vote. City councilors are voted are in office by a relatively small number of votes, and if this neighborhood, which has as many voters as it does, can articulate a vision for what it wants to see, or some of that, you can be effective, and you can help the city staff help you be effective. That's one thing. Let me just say, I can't emphasize enough the importance of neighborhoods taking initiative. And I'll give you a little example of something that represents what I'm trying to articulate, that Steve was involved with. I used to live in West Cambridge, out at the edge of the city, on the Belmont-Cambridge border. We lived on a street which, when we first moved there, was very quiet. When they rebuilt the Alewife Bridge, our little street became the new superhighway by all the traffic that was diverted by the construction of the highway. And so for years, we lived with an increasing number of cars speeding down this little narrow street. One of the people that lived just a few doors down from me was the chief assessor of the city of Cambridge, Rudy Russo, who grew up here on Brookline Street. Rudy spent half his life trying to get his colleagues in the city to change the rules of the game with respect to this street. Sadly, he died before we were successful. But we were successful, the 14 families that lived on that street, by getting the city manager to commit funds to cleaning up that street and making modifications in it. Originally, their plan was to simply make it easier for more cars to use the street. Because at the time, we had a traffic commissioner, so-called, who only believed that more was better. We had the opposite point of view. We said, no, we want this street to go back to being a residential street. We want it to have proper sidewalks. We want it to have proper bikeways. We want it to make sure that when it snows in the wintertime, there's a place for snow to be stored and people still be able to take their children to school and so on. So we prepared a plan. And also the street connects with the town of Belmont in probably one of the worst intersections between the two cities. And Steve helped us design a rotary for that intersection. And we got the town of Belmont to agree to the plan, and we got Rich Rossi, who was then the deputy city manager, to understand that that's the plan we wanted to see built. and that if he didn't want to do that, we had 3 litigators on the street who would make his life miserable until he did. He said, fine. He said, we'll do it just your way. Now, it is a very successful street. The mums, there are now new families that live on that street with little children. They can walk their prams up and down a safe sidewalk. People in wheelchairs can actually have a sidewalk to roll on. The sidewalks were completely illegal. So we did something that should have been done by Public Works and so on, but it simply was not on their, and the traffic department at that time. There's different leadership now. But the point is that when you do take the initiative, you may not have the perfect answer, but you get something started that's much more interesting, much more successful, and much happier because you're not always fighting, sort of banging your head against the wall. But you do have people in this neighborhood who have terrific capacities and resources, and you should use them. And that one example, I think, is an illustrative of what a small group of people can do in a particular area where you have a special problem. But in general, you generalize that to the neighborhood, and every part of this neighborhood, every block in this neighborhood has some problem that needs solving. And I think if you do one thing, if you help each block begin to realize that it can sort of take care of itself and be an effective player in this game, cumulatively you'll have a much more successful neighborhood.
Yeah, I'm just thinking it's almost 9 o'clock, so maybe we should talk about what's coming up next.
Kathy has asked that we continue this kind of workshop format, and I hope next time you'll feel enthusiastic and bring more ideas or more issues, and cumulatively we'll be able to give you something that is, I think, a little more meaty. We'll talk about, we've talked tonight about where we've been, how we got to where we are today. The next session really will be looking at what are the impending issues that are coming to affect the neighborhood. Suzanne has described one, and I'm sure there are many others that each of you could contribute. So what we'd like to do is to essentially assemble what the emerging issues are, where the pressure points are going to be in the neighborhood over the next 10 years or so. And then in the final session, we'll try to share with you ways in which these things might be solutions to those problems might be accomplished. Some of them might be very simple, some of them might be a little more complex, but at least you'll have an opportunity to explore those. We may even talk to people from other parts of the metropolitan area who've gone through the same process, and you might enjoy their experience, and they might be able to be helpful and show you at least how they did it. So that's the 3-part arrangement. We hope at the end of that we'll be able to give the folks in the Community Development Department a more articulate and more focused sense of what's important to the neighborhood so that they can help you work with that and begin to get your projects on the capital budget, your projects before council if that requires a council action, and before the manager in a coherent way so that he can plan for the necessary financing of whatever the things that you need done. And last but not least, you shouldn't always feel you're dependent on the city. You ought to be thinking about using your 501c3 as a way in which to encourage contributions so that you have resources that you can use or that you can use to stimulate other contributions to the neighborhood's improvement. Again, other neighborhoods have done that, and I would recommend that to you as one of the strategies that you might explore at the end of this process. There's a question back there.
Yeah.
Yes, I think Kathy
Yeah, so I know, so we realized we had a really hard time coming up with the dates for these meetings. We wanted to make sure that CNA board members could attend. We wanted to make sure Bob could attend. It was hard to find dates. But we were reminded today that February 19th, our next meeting, it's a Tuesday, is during school vacation week. And I don't know how many of you will be impacted by that. But you know what though, Catherine, I was thinking well, we should just be flexible. But then I realized Bob's going on vacation. Bob's going to be away. And so I don't know if we can be flexible, but I think what we've got to do is make sure that there are other ways that people can provide feedback. And we had talked a little bit about doing maybe a survey monkey. The other thought is that we're so thrilled that all of you have participated in tonight's discussion. We hope you're like going to come back for more and more. But maybe we should be doing a survey monkey survey as well to get some more feedback from other neighbors. And there may be other ways we can be getting data from other neighbors as well.
I would just say that this should not be the end, it should be the beginning. So that I think my goal, as I expressed it to Kathy when she got me involved in this, was what's really important is to find some way of engaging more of the people in the neighborhood in essentially protecting their future. And that the more people that are engaged in some kind of organized way, the more effective they'll be. But that means really a continuing commitment of people who are willing to work on projects, work on sub-issues and so on, and then come back to the neighborhood with recommended solutions or ideas and so on. So that this is more like trying to get ignition going and rather than ending in an abrupt way. So I think there'll be lots of opportunities to expand on the conversations we're having. And I would encourage you also to talk to your neighbors so that looking at the map, it's interesting to see how many blocks are covered by the people that are here and how many blocks are not. So I think part of the deal here is if you go out and talk to people in areas that are not represented here today and begin to get them to think about the fact they ought to be concerned about what's happening in their immediate vicinity with their immediate neighbors, you can build a constituency that could be quite effective. Now, not everybody's going to participate. That's just, yeah. On the other hand, the more you do, the more engaged you get other people. And again, if you reach out to professionals who live in the neighborhood, I think you'll find that if you ask people to help, they generally will. If you just expect them to help without inviting them, they generally don't, because they have other things to do. They have other lives to live. But so I think it's a valuable exercise in seeing how far you can stretch your arms and bring in other people and get to know, firstly get to know your neighbors, but also to get more people involved in the excitement of building a more amenable community.
And if you can't attend the next session, please write down maybe your ideas. You can send them to me. You can post them to the CNA listserv so that they're out there. The other thing is that Rebecca is going to be posting more things to Cambridgeport.org under Cambridgeport Study, Seaport Study, and I'll give her the MIT letter that you sent to me to post there, so you'll see what the initial president of MIT's intent was when he purchased the Simplex land. And Bob, you had said you might be assigning homework.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Well, I think we didn't want to frighten you too much, but you know, most of us have been in the education business all our lives, so our normal tendency is to give homework assignments at the expectation that you'll really learn something and enjoy it and come back with some great idea that we hadn't thought about. So thank you very much.
That is the homework assignment.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, that's
So I
the
think the
homework
homework assignment is to look at the material you've gotten. Look carefully at it. For instance, if you have a zoning map, go to the zoning ordinance, it's online, and find out what does SD 11 mean? What does SD 12 say? What does that mean? What kind of buildings can be built there? How tall can they be? how much open space do they require? Just take one or two little items, and you'll learn essentially how to use that technique and be able to be much more informed citizens.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bob. Thanks, Suzanne. Thanks, Kit, and thanks to Daniel Wolf here from Cambridge Community Development for all the printouts. You can
residents.
thank him for the posters, the profiles. Thank you very, very much. And do you have any final
If you want to know more
words,
about the
Dan?
Maine College of Art,
Sorry you didn't introduce myself earlier. I'll be hopefully attending the next two if they, or if they
it's
change schedule, I might not be able
I think we're gonna keep
it's
on schedule because
very
I think we
interesting. I
have
was
to.
up there with him last week, and
Yeah, I do need help. Okay, so
very
Dan, you'll
interesting.
be continuing to talk to us,
Very
right?
lively.
Okay, and listen as well. Everyone, we need to get
Yeah,
these
and Portland's
chairs
a great city.
back into the kitchen, please.
My son has a lot of
It's on
clients
the
in food industry.
19th, so
Well, it is the 19th.
it will be the
Such a
19th.
great restaurant.
Yeah, thank you all for coming.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Have you been there?
No, I haven't been to that one.
They source everything in Maine, so like you will not get pepper. Only like Maine.
There's one group
about the